America's power grid wasn't built for this moment, and that is not a metaphor. For the past 15 years, electricity demand in the United States was nearly flat. Utilities planned around that reality, engineers designed around it, politicians budgeted around it. And then, almost overnight, everything changed. Not because of one technology, not because of one company, but because three massive forces arrived at exactly the same time and hit a system that had no room to absorb them. This is not a story about electric vehicles. It is not a story about artificial intelligence. It is a story about power itself and about who controls it, who loses access to it, and why that question may be the most important economic and strategic question of the next 20 years. Let's start with a number that almost nobody is talking about. In 2024, data centers around the world consumed 415 terawatt hours of electricity. By 2030, the International Energy Agency projects that number will nearly double to 945 terawatt hours. The United States and China together will account for nearly 80% of that growth. To put that in terms you can actually feel, the additional electricity demand being added by artificial intelligence infrastructure over the next 6 years is equivalent to adding an entirely new country to the global grid, a country that never sleeps, never slows down, and never negotiates on price. Now here's where the story gets complicated. The companies building that artificial intelligence infrastructure are not passive electricity consumers. They are not simply paying a utility bill and moving on. Microsoft, Meta, Amazon, Google, and a growing list of others are signing long-term nuclear power contracts, building dedicated energy infrastructure, and in some cases constructing generation capacity right next to their data centers. They are not waiting for the grid to catch up. They are building around it. That tells you something important about what these companies believe, that the existing power system cannot deliver what they need at the scale they need it in the time they have to move. And they are right. The American grid was not designed for simultaneous explosive growth across multiple sectors. For decades, the engineering assumption was that demand would grow slowly and predictably, driven mostly by population growth and modest industrial expansion. The system that exists today reflects that assumption. The transmission lines, the substations, the transformers, the interconnection queues, all of it was sized and scheduled for a world that no longer exists. When a new data center wants to connect to the grid today, it enters a process that can take years, not months, years. Transformer shortages are real and worsening. Substation congestion is not a theoretical problem. It is already turning away projects in some of the most economically active regions in the country. Goldman Sachs has pointed to especially tight conditions in California, the Midwest, and the Mid-Atlantic, where new demand is colliding with limited supply and the cost of adding capacity is rising sharply. This is the hidden architecture of the artificial intelligence race. Everyone focuses on the chips, the software, the models, the parameters, but underneath all of that is a physical requirement. Electricity delivered continuously at enormous scale in specific locations 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. A data center running advanced GPU clusters cannot throttle down at night the way a factory might. It cannot shift its load to off-peak hours. It needs power that is dense, reliable, and constant. And right now, the American grid is not consistently able to provide that. Consider what that means competitively. If you are a company trying to train the next generation of artificial intelligence models, and your compute capacity is constrained not by your investment budget or your engineering team, but by whether a substation in Virginia or Texas can handle your load, then your strategic problem is fundamentally an energy problem. The artificial intelligence race is also an electricity race, and that connection is not widely understood. Now layer on the second wave. Electric vehicles are adding a different kind of pressure to the same system. Unlike data centers, which tend to be concentrated in specific geographic clusters, electric vehicles are distributed across the entire country. Every garage, every parking lot, every highway corridor becomes a potential new load point. The numbers are large and growing. According to projections tied to International Energy Agency data, United States electric vehicle electricity demand could reach around 283 terawatt hours by 2030 under moderate scenarios, and over 700 terawatt hours by 2035 in more aggressive ones. For reference, total global electric vehicle electricity demand in 2023 was around 130 terawatt hours. The growth curve is steep. Here is the part that most discussions miss. The problem with electric vehicles is not the total volume of electricity they will eventually consume. The problem is where and when that consumption happens. Most people charge at home, at night, using whatever outlet or charging equipment they have. That behavior tends to cluster. If you live in a neighborhood where electric vehicle adoption has grown quickly, and 10 or 20 or where 30% of your neighbors are all plugging in between 6 and 10 in the evening, your local distribution network may not have been designed to handle that combined load. The issue is not whether electricity exists somewhere in the country. The issue is whether it can get to the right transformer on your street at the right moment. This is what engineers call a distribution problem, and it is fundamentally different from the generation problem. You can build a new power plant and still not solve a distribution problem. The bottleneck is infrastructure that is close to the ground, close to the customer, and in many cases decades old. Now ask yourself what happens when you combine these two pressures. Data centers pulling enormous blocks of power from regional transmission systems. Electric vehicles adding distributed, time-sensitive demand across local distribution networks. And underneath all of it, a grid that was engineered for a world where electricity demand barely moved for 15 years. That is the collision that is already beginning. And there is a third force that most people forget to include in this picture: industrial reshoring. The United States has, in recent years, made a significant policy push to bring semiconductor manufacturing, battery production, and other advanced industrial capacity back onto American soil. Those factories are not small. A modern semiconductor fabrication plant can consume as much electricity as a small city. A large battery gigafactory runs continuously and requires stable, high-quality power. When you add industrial reshoring to the data center build-out and the electric vehicle charging expansion, you are looking at a structural increase in American electricity demand that has no historical precedent in the modern era. The Energy Information Administration says that after 5 years of average annual growth of 2.1%, United States electricity consumption is projected to keep rising through 2050. Goldman Sachs has argued that data centers alone could account for 40% of electricity demand growth and keep electricity prices elevated through the end of the decade. If that analysis is correct, electricity is not just getting more expensive for large corporations, it is getting more expensive for everyone. The cost of upgrading a grid to serve a hyperscale data center does not disappear. It gets distributed across ratepayers. Consumers end up paying, in part, for infrastructure built to serve corporate artificial intelligence ambitions. That is not a conspiracy. That is how utility economics works. So who is actually positioned to benefit from this situation? Nuclear power is experiencing a revival that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago. The reason is straightforward. Artificial intelligence companies need power that is firm, meaning it runs regardless of weather or time of day. Solar and wind are intermittent by nature. Natural gas can fill gaps, but it carries fuel price risk and carbon complications. Nuclear power runs at high capacity factors continuously and produces no carbon emissions. For a company trying to sign a 20-year power contract to anchor a data center campus, nuclear checks almost every box. This is why technology companies are suddenly investing in nuclear startups, signing contracts with existing plant operators, and in some cases, exploring the construction of small modular reactors on or near their own campuses. Grid storage technology is also seeing renewed urgency. If you cannot always get power exactly when you need it from the transmission system, you need to be able to store it when it is available and dispatch it when it is not. Utility-scale battery installations are growing rapidly, driven both by the economics of renewable energy and by the need to buffer a grid that is increasingly under stress. Tesla's Megapack business is one visible example of this trend, but it is far from alone. The market for grid-scale storage is expanding quickly, and the companies that can manufacture at scale and deploy quickly have a significant commercial opportunity. This is where the story reveals one of its more striking paradoxes. Elon Musk's companies sit on both sides of the problem simultaneously. Through Tesla, he has accelerated electric vehicle adoption, which adds load to the grid. Through Tesla's energy division, he is selling megapacks and expanding virtual power plant operations, which help stabilize the grid. And through his artificial intelligence venture, he is building some of the most electricity-intensive compute infrastructure on the planet, which adds enormous new demand. Reuters has reported that this expansion is moving toward 2 gigawatts of capacity tied to dedicated power infrastructure, because the regional grid simply cannot absorb that scale of load without major upgrades. Musk is not unique in this position. He is simply the most visible example of a pattern that is emerging across the technology industry. Companies that create electricity demand are increasingly investing in the infrastructure to supply it, because they have concluded that waiting for utilities and regulators to move at their traditional pace is not a viable competitive strategy. Now, here is the question worth sitting with. What happens to the companies and the regions that do not solve this problem in time? Because the advantages of having reliable, affordable, abundant power are not evenly distributed. A company that locks in a long-term nuclear power agreement at favorable rates has a structural cost advantage over a competitor that is buying power on the spot market from a stressed grid. A region that has invested heavily in transmission upgrades and new generation capacity will attract data center investment. A region that has not will watch that investment go elsewhere. Electricity access is becoming a competitive moat, the way port access once was for maritime trade or highway proximity once was for manufacturing. China understands this. The comparison between the two countries at this moment is instructive and uncomfortable. China has a stronger record of rapid grid expansion, faster permitting for new generation and transmission, and a more coordinated approach to connecting industrial capacity to power supply. The International Energy Agency projects that China will be one of the two largest contributors to data center electricity demand growth globally, but China also has demonstrated the ability to build infrastructure at a speed that the fragmented American regulatory system cannot easily match. For electric vehicles, China's charging and battery ecosystem is more integrated and more rapidly deployed. For artificial intelligence infrastructure, the United States holds clear advantages in chip design, cloud platforms, and frontier model development. But those advantages could be eroded if American companies cannot physically connect their compute to the power they need. This is not a distant hypothetical. The interconnection queues in the United States are already measured in years. The transformer shortage is real. The permitting timelines for new transmission lines can stretch over a decade. These are not problems that resolve themselves. They require sustained investment, regulatory reform, and a level of coordination between the public and private sectors that has not historically characterized American energy policy. Do you think the United States can build the grid it needs fast enough to stay competitive? Or are we already too far behind? Leave your answer in the comments because the people watching this right now have different views on that question, and that conversation matters. Here is the conclusion that the data leads to, even if it is rarely stated this plainly. The strategic resource of the 21st century is not oil, it is not code, it is electricity. Not in a metaphorical sense, but in the most literal, physical, industrial sense. The country, the company, the region that can deliver reliable, affordable, abundant electric power at the scale that artificial intelligence infrastructure and advanced manufacturing require will have a structural advantage in every dimension of the economy that matters over the next 30 years. Compute runs on electricity. Electric vehicles run on electricity. Semiconductor fabrication runs on electricity. The reindustrialization of the American economy runs on electricity. And right now, the system that delivers that electricity was built for a world that no longer exists. The grid is not background infrastructure anymore. It is the battlefield. And the companies and countries that figured that out first are already moving. The question is whether the rest of the system moves fast enough to keep up. If you want to stay ahead of what is coming in energy, technology, and the industries that are being reshaped by both, this channel covers exactly that. The next shift is already happening, and you are better off seeing it coming. Subscribe so you do not get caught off guard.